Friday Forum, Oregon's premier public affairs forum. I'm Jim Zarin, president of City Club, and I welcome you all, those of you here at the Governor Hotel, and those of you listening on OPB or KBBS radio or watching on cable television. Thank you for joining us for this week's Friday Forum on this, the 10th of April, 2009. Today we'll hear about the AIDS epidemic, how it affects Oregonians, and the current response to it. But first I have some announcements. In consideration of those sitting close to you and those in our radio and television audiences, I ask everyone in the room who has not already done so to please turn off your cell phone or other device that might make noise. As always, we recognize our Friday Forum corporate sponsors for this quarter, without whose generous financial support these time-honored City Club Friday Forum luncheons would not be possible. Our corporate sponsors for this quarter are Portland General Electric, the law firm Schwabe Williamson Wyatt, and Northwest Natural. We thank them for their support. And if your company or firm would like to be a Friday Forum sponsor or a sponsor of the club's nationally acclaimed citizen-driven research program, please talk with club staff at the back of the room or call the club office. Now, despite the support of our Friday Forum corporate sponsors, and as many of you know, City Club is not immune from the effects of the economic conditions we're all facing. Indeed, the club is projecting a $35,000 operating budget deficit this fiscal year ending May 31st, unless we continue to turn things around. Now, as many of you know, the club's board of governors and staff have been working hard to cut the budget wherever we can and to mobilize club members to generate additional revenues to fill the budget gap. Now, you all can help in this effort, and frankly, we need your help and ask for it. One of the most effective ways you can help is to participate in the club's spring membership drive that now is fully underway. And you can do this in a couple of different ways. If you are not a member, become one. If you are a lapsed member, rejoin. And if you are already a member, recruit a new or lapsed member to join. Taking these steps may not seem like much of a contribution for the club's budget deficit problem, but in fact it is very important and it's working. After all, if 200 people join the club during this membership drive at the regular membership rate of $165 per person, that will generate $33,000 in new revenues for the club and essentially erase the deficit. So it is important. We can and will do this if everybody does their part. And to encourage you all to participate and to keep it going, we have some incentives. First, during the spring membership drive, the one-time $25 registration fee is waived. Second, when an existing member recruits a new or lapsed member to join, both the recruiting member and the new member will receive a voucher for a free Friday Forum luncheon of their choice. And third, the member who recruits the most new or lapsed members to join during the spring membership drive will win the grand prize of a dinner for two at the new Nel Canto restaurant opening up in the Hotel Modera in downtown Portland this spring. And finally, please do be aware that membership fees and other contributions to City Club are 100% tax deductible on your federal and Oregon state income taxes, so there's a built-in discount to the membership fee and any amount you might contribute. Please demonstrate what City Club programming like these Friday Forums means to you by generously giving of your time and money during this special drive. City Club's programs, in my view, have played a major role in making Portland, Portland, and Oregon, Oregon for 93 years, and we don't intend for that to change now. But we need your help and look forward to it. Membership forms are available. If not on your tables at the back of the room, please use one or more than one and help us out. And speaking of club programming, let me quickly mention the events that City Club and its committees are sponsoring yet in April. First, on April 13th, next Monday, in collaboration with Portland Spaces Magazine, the Bright Light series at Jimmy Mac's in the Pearl continues, this time with a discussion of Portland's special public places such as Pioneer Square, which is celebrating its 25th anniversary. Then on April 25th, the club's new Leaders Council is hosting a trail walk and discussion of our region's growing trail system, led by Metro President David Bragdon and Washington County Commissioner Dick Scouten. On April 29th, the club's Citizen Read book group will discuss the book Beauty of the City, a biography of famed Portland architect A.E. Doyle, with the author of the book participating in the meeting. And next week here at Friday Forum, a panel will address the provocative question, If newspapers die, can democracy survive? The panel will feature the Oregonians executive editor, a professor of journalism from the University of Oregon, and the club's own executive director, Charity Fain. Now, interestingly, Charity has her own firsthand experience with democracy building in the post-Soviet world without an independent press, so she has a real perspective on this to offer. That's right here for the Friday Forum next week. Details regarding these and other City Club programs not mentioned can be found in the club's weekly bulletin and on the club's website. And now to our program for today. What is now commonly known as AIDS was first reported in the U.S. in mid-1981 by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, the CDC. In the beginning, the CDC did not even have an official name for the disease, often referring to it by the names of the diseases that were associated with it. It wasn't until late 1982 that the CDC even began using the term AIDS. However, research indicates that AIDS probably started in Africa and may have entered the United States as early as the late 1960s. Whatever its origin in history, there is little dispute that AIDS now constitutes a major public health problem. With an estimated 33.2 million people living with the disease worldwide, AIDS is now considered to be a pandemic. In other words, a worldwide epidemic. Yet how much do those of us not directly touched by AIDS really know about it? Indeed, how many of us can even say what AIDS stands for? I can. It stands for Acquired Immunodeficiency Syndrome, but I know that only because I looked it up last night. And what is the difference between AIDS and HIV? What is it like to live with AIDS today? Or is the question, what is it like to live with HIV today? Or are both questions valid? What are the current approaches to fighting the disease, and how does all of this play out here in Oregon and affect Oregonians? Well, we are fortunate today to have a speaker with us who can answer these and other questions about AIDS and HIV. In fact, our speaker first started working with HIV and AIDS in 1992 when he tested HIV positive himself and started working with a support group for HIV positive youth in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He also served as the founding director of a center in Minneapolis run by and for gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender youth. Later, he worked at the Academy for Educational Development, AED, in Washington, D.C., where he focused on such areas as correctional health, domestic HIV programs, and tuberculosis prevention. Our speaker then went on to serve as the Vice President for International AIDS Programs and Deputy Director for the Center on AIDS and Community Health at AID in Washington. And in that role at AID, he led HIV prevention and care programs in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And in 2008, he joined Portland's Cascade AIDS Project, where he serves as the Executive Director. Now, on a personal note, our speaker tells me that he is and always been somewhat of a workaholic, and that when he does have time off, he is happy to relax and watch TV, everything from CNN to sitcoms. He says that trait makes him feel like he's struggling some to fit into the active Portland and Northwest lifestyle. However, he also notes that he says he typically walks and rides his bike to get around, and in fact, he has been car-free for all but 2 years of his adult life, and my thought is that sounds very Portland to me. So, please help me welcome today's speaker for his first time at our Friday Forum microphone, the Executive Director of the Cascade AIDS Project, Michael Kaplan. Michael?
Good afternoon. Today I'm hoping to cover HIV/AIDS from a series of different perspectives. My intent is to talk about it from a public health standpoint in terms of the implications for HIV and what it has to do with our healthcare system and the impact in terms of how we address it from a public health standpoint. But to also talk about it from a political standpoint in terms of how public policy has sometimes helped our response and sometimes limited our response to HIV and AIDS, and how the public discourse about HIV/AIDS and the communities impacted and affected by HIV have been impacted by the public discourse in terms of how we treat those communities. And then thirdly, I hope to share a little bit of a personal perspective in terms of my own experience living with HIV for 17 years and some personal experience of what that means. I struggle to bring something new to a lot of folks here because beyond seeing a lot of my staff and board members in the room, I see folks who have been activists in this community working on HIV/AIDS long before I have, whether it was here or on the East Coast, people who work at DHS in terms of surveillance and epidemiology. And so for those who know it, I just hope it's a reminder, but I'm hoping to bring some new people along on the dialogue. What I hadn't planned to cover, but I'm going to just because Jim put the question up, and I should cover for those who don't even know the topic, is the difference between HIV and AIDS. As Jim mentioned, AIDS is acquired immune deficiency syndrome. I want to be very clear. HIV is the virus. It's a human immunodeficiency virus, and HIV is the virus that leads to AIDS. So anyone who's HIV infected has the virus. They're not necessarily living with AIDS until either their immune system has reached such a level that their T cells are only at 200, or they've had a couple opportunistic infections. That said, overall, I'm going to avoid the biological and the science, talk a little more about the public and the political. Before I go into that, let me just put a quick picture of where we are today in the US and globally. I'm going to talk about the timeline, and as Jim mentioned, 1981 was when we first started seeing the epidemic. 28 years later, we have 25 million people who've died due to HIV or AIDS around the world, and 33 million people currently living with the virus. Every year around the globe, there's 2.7 million new infections happening, and 2 million more people dying each year from a disease that's 100% preventable. I'm going to talk a little bit about what it is in the US, and I know most of our attention's been turned to Africa, and Africa has the brunt of the disease right now. 60% of infections, 23 million of the 33 million infections are currently on the sub-Saharan continent. Before we go to kind of more statistics, I want to do a little background. Jim mentioned 1981, and that's when we first started seeing the virus. That was the CDC and a health alert in terms of pneumonia or skin cancer appearing in a few gay men in LA. And as Jim mentioned, they weren't calling it AIDS then, and he said they were calling it names of other opportunistic infections. In fact, what we were calling it, or at least the media was calling it in 81 and 82, was GRID, which stood for Gay-Related Immune Deficiency. For the first several years, this was clearly focused in on the gay community and clearly in the US, and for the most part back then, it was on the coast. Things changed a lot over the years, and I want to talk about how we got there. In 1981, when they were first experiencing it in Oregon, we had 2 cases diagnosed. I'm going to go by leaps of 5, 10 years. So 1988. By 1988, 863 people in Oregon were living with HIV, and 114 people in our state had already died. And the reason I want to talk about 1988 is there was a big political thing that happened with Cascade AIDS Project back then. And it's not that I want to pick old fights, but I think there were some lessons to be learned that I'm not clear we've learned in this state or even in the response to HIV/AIDS. In 1988, the Cascade AIDS Project was 5 years old, and they ran a campaign, or they tried to run a campaign. And the campaign was intended to run on TriMet and in the Oregonian and in other papers. And because I can't do pictures for the radio, I'm going to try to describe it. It was a picture of 2 men with fully clothed, fairly conservative looking by today's standards, with their arms around one another. And below it, all it said is, "We can live together." And it talked about the way HIV was impacting the gay community. Well, the campaign launched in '88 but didn't get that far. And as I said, I was living somewhere else back then. But from what I read in the press and the articles that came out, the Oregonian refused to run the campaign. And after only a few runs in TriMet, the campaign was pulled down because of the protests about that this campaign was gay promotion rather than HIV prevention. I'm going to share a couple of quotes that were happening around that time. At that time, the associate editor of the Oregonian, David Reinhardt, wrote about the campaign. And his comment was, "It should appear nowhere in public, save some gay publications. The poster is less about AIDS protection than gay promotion. The poster is tasteless and offensive." Again, two men fully clothed, arms around each other, simply to say, we can live through this together. Stephanie Oliver, as Director of Public Affairs for TriMet, had the response, "We are open to looking at any future AIDS public service ads that you develop, which would be appropriate to our readership." I'm sorry, that was the Oregonian, who again said, "We don't feel like this is our readership." And eventually, TriMet pulled the campaign, thinking it was inappropriate for their riders. Now, I want to talk a little bit about kind of those comments and why it impacts our response in public health and why I think we need to learn from them. I'm going to relay it to my own story. In 1986, I graduated high school. I was, by all measures, sort of kind of the model high school student, very involved in student body. I was living in Wichita, Kansas, a very different place from Portland, but not that different in terms of, community, smaller, tight-knit. I was the prom king of my graduating high school. I was dating girls. I was out there. In 1986, I also knew well I was gay. I was what the CDC calls MSM, meaning, we talk about HIV among gay and bisexual men, but that doesn't cover it. There are many, many men who are struggling with their sexual identity who never in their life are going to identify as gay or bisexual, but who may experience or experiment in same-sex behavior. And so when you go back to the Oregonian saying, this doesn't apply to our readership, this isn't who we're trying to reach, or you go back to TriMet pulling the campaign and saying, this needs to be focused in the gay community, let me be clear. I was that guy dating some of your daughters. I was there at high school as the prom king. I was having to explore what it meant to be gay by not telling a single person, but sneaking out after dark, going to places where the only place you could explore what it meant to be gay is in a place you didn't have power, whether it was sneaking into a bar or a film house, where there was someone else, probably someone older, who was ready to tell you and show you what it meant to be gay, where the first experience of being gay was about a sexual interaction rather than a culture at that time. And so what we do by talking about gay and bisexual and that we need to focus there on an HIV response is we miss not only all those who may never identify as gay or bisexual, but we miss all those who I may have been interacting with and others who may be interacting with who are at risk because they don't know that the people they are dating have experimented. By 1992, I was living in Minnesota, and I don't know how many folks will remember, but that's when Magic Johnson came out as being HIV positive. There's some sweet irony in terms of history. We saw Rock Hudson come out. I think what finally moved the world to care were things like Ryan White, the young child who was the innocent victim of HIV/AIDS, infected through blood products as a hemophiliac, or Magic Johnson, who we could all relate to as a straight man, a basketball star who was our hero. The sweet irony or the sweet happiness was from the gay community, finally, we got the world's attention. Unfortunately, it was only because finally it was hitting someone else and not hitting us. And still, for the gay community, it wasn't a focus in terms of how public health responded. In 1992, shortly after Magic Johnson tested positive, I tested HIV positive myself. And testing HIV positive then is a radically different thing than today, both in what you know about health outcomes and how long people can live well with the disease, but also in terms of going in and getting tested. Back then, it took over a month just to get in terms of the queue of people who were wanting to get tested because Magic was positive, and the wait after they took your blood to get your results. But today we have the instant testing, or same-day results. By 1994, we made huge advances. The U.S. public health system was recommending AZT for pregnant women, And we were able in the US to reduce HIV transmission from mother to child by 70%, meaning a mother living with HIV could now have an HIV-positive, HIV-negative baby. And in later years, we even brought it down further and have now achieved that in developing countries as well. In 1994-95, in Oregon, 1,789 people were dead by then. 2,366 known cases of HIV and AIDS, and probably about 4,000 people infected in the state. During that same time, AIDS had become the leading cause of death for all Americans, all Americans between the ages of 25 and 44. The other big change that happened about HIV, and I'm going to talk about this later in terms of what it means in our response today, is HAART was introduced, which is highly active antiretroviral therapy. Combination of therapies, AZT came on the scene in '92, and all of a sudden, HIV wasn't necessarily a death sentence. It was a virus that had some severe implications, but that people were living 10, 15, now I've lived 17 years, my partner 20 years, with the virus due to new advances of treatment in terms of healthy living and many other changes. And so by the mid-90s, we had a huge change. No longer were people dying as quick as they were getting infected. And in fact, today, the pool of people living with HIV grows and grows because we've had huge advances on treatment, but not near the success in prevention. By 2003, our country really upped the response, and we did internationally. In Oregon, 3,000 people were dead, 4,078 known cases, and estimate about 6,000 people living with the virus. One of the things that happened in 2003 was the Bush administration announced PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. And our government did some amazing things. I often talk about it in terms of that effort, however, as the saying, a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down. And as someone who was working in AIDS, it sort of felt like billions of dollars helped bad policies get swallowed. And so what happened was the Bush administration at that time said, we're going to fight AIDS globally, and we are committing over the next 5 years $15 billion. What was amazing is we upped the response, we doubled the amount of funding we were doing, and we got people focused on what was happening in the developing world. This medicine or the bad policies that had to go with it from a personal perspective was we actually said 1/3 of all of those prevention dollars had to be used for abstinence until marriage. And let me I'm going to come back to Oregon, but share why that's sort of a little bit crazy in some countries. One of the countries I worked a lot in was Botswana, the second highest prevalence rate in the world. 1.4 million people, 1 out of every 4 living with HIV and AIDS. In this country, 70% of mothers have never been married. And our country response had the U.S. ambassador standing in front of people, opening a clinic of HIV testing and talking to the Botswana in terms of saying how important abstinence until marriage into a culture where 70% of mothers are never used to getting married. Or Latin America, where the prevalence was 1-2% among the general population, but 10 to 12% among commercial sex workers and men who have sex with men. And so really the drivers of the epidemic and the people who were getting infected were those who we had policies who said, yeah, well, we said abstinence until marriage, and as a gay man, I guess that means abstinence for life. Or for commercial sex workers, our government, the U.S. government, actually said, we want you to sign a policy that condemns prostitution. In fact, we passed a policy, a federal law that said any agency receiving federal dollars must condemn prostitutes. Luckily, our Supreme Court turned that over in terms of U.S. organizations, but organizations in developing countries are not protected by the courts of the U.S., so if they wanted the federal funds, they still had to have that policy that was condemning. So we've had some difficult policies over the past couple years, but we also raised the response. The other challenge that happened in with the response of PEPFAR was we said we were going to focus on these countries, and all of a sudden people said, Africa, Africa, and absolutely we had to focus. But let me tell you, you don't have to go to Africa to see an epidemic out of control. You can go to our nation's capital and find HIV prevalence rates higher than all of Western Africa. Ghana has an HIV prevalence of a 1.5%. Nigeria has an HIV prevalence of 3%, and our government has says they are an emergency priority country for our international response to AIDS. In our nation's capital, a majority African-American city where people don't get represented in our Senate nor voting rights in Congress, 3% of the population is living with HIV and AIDS. So we have the problems right here in the US. Let me talk a little bit about the US statistics. Right now in the US, 1.1 million Americans are living with HIV. 20% of them don't even know they're infected. 40% of infections can be attributed to the 20% who don't know their status. And let me talk about people say, well, you're HIV positive. If you would just disclose it, we could stop new infections. There's hundreds of thousands of Americans who have no clue they're HIV positive and didn't even think they were at risk. And the idea that disclosure, that the positive people have to disclose, sort of takes away all the individual power that each of us have to say, we're responsible for our own bodies and what we can do in terms of protection for ourselves. Last year, the CDC announced, you know what, for the last 8 years, we thought HIV infections were stable and that we were having about 40,000 new infections a year. In fact, they revised that in September of 2008 and said, we were underestimating, and there are 56,000 new infections happening each year in the US. 14,000 deaths. So that means every year that 1.1 million is growing by another 30,000. Larger pool of people living with HIV, greater demand on services, greater potential for new infections. There's been a big change in the last 6 months, and I'm going to get political for a second. My best friend runs a group in Washington, D.C. called the National Minority AIDS Council, and I was just talking with him last week, and he said, you know, for 8 years, during the Bush administration, I'd never been invited to the White House. Prior to that, he was. And in the last 4 months, he has been there 6 times for efforts to discuss how is our country going to respond to HIV and AIDS. And so I'm kind of excited for the first time our White House has once again got involved and actually brought up some hard topics. I don't know if people here saw it. I'm watching time. But this week, the White House, not the CDC, launched a campaign called 9.5 Minutes. That is, every 9.5 minutes in the United States, another person will be HIV infected. And my friend got to go to the White House and be there, and it was amazing. The conversation was no longer, let us talk about those that are infected only through blood products or heterosexuals, but they talked about gays as well and bisexuals and men who aren't out. And they started a whole new level of awareness, and I encourage people to look at the 9.5minute.gov campaign. I also want to talk about infections nationally in terms of who's getting hit. 50% of infections are still among gay and bisexual men in the US, and 50% of infections in this country are among African Americans. If you are black in the US, you are 5 times more likely to be HIV infected than if you are white. And I'm going to come back in a minute to the social justice issues behind that. But let's take it to Oregon. So in 1988, I mentioned 863 people were living and 114 dead. Today, 7,000 people living with HIV, 3,300 Oregonians dead due to a virus, 100% preventable. Today in Oregon, 300 new HIV infections are happening each and every year, and 100 deaths. Now, let me be clear. The epidemic looks very different depending on where you are in the U.S. I talked about nationally 50% of the epidemic was among gay and bisexual men. In Oregon, 75% of all new infections are among men who have sex with men, gay or bisexual, sometimes using injecting drugs, sometimes not. But let me be clear. They're not the only ones getting infected. If you engage in risk behavior, if you do sexual intercourse without a condom, and you are not in a monogamous relationship and you can't confirm who your partner has been with, there is the potential you have put yourself at risk. 10% of infections are among injecting drug users, And today, the CDC shared studies of a new study that showed that 75% of American injecting drug users participate in vaginal intercourse without a condom. So you may not be an injecting drug user, and you may not believe in syringe exchange and needle and clean needles for injecting drug users. You may just be that heterosexual person sleeping with an injecting drug user, and they haven't disclosed that status. So it all goes through these social networks. 15% about varies, and it's nerve-wracking having an epidemiologist from DHS here to correct me later, but about 15% of infections are among heterosexual populations. So really, this is an epidemic hitting anyone and everyone. And in Oregon, African Americans are 3 times more likely than whites to be HIV infected, Latinos slightly more likely than whites to be HIV infected, and approximately 12% of infections are among women. I'm going to share a couple more stats, and I want to talk about the response, and I got to hurry up. One interesting thing I want to share is in the state of Oregon, 39% of people who test HIV positive will develop AIDS within 12 months or have AIDS at the time of testing. And this is important. So I've lived 17 years with HIV and have not gone to AIDS. And through healthy living, through support of loved ones, through treatment, through good medical care, you can live many years. But you have to know your status. And if you look at the disparities about who develops AIDS quicker, it's actually interesting. It's actually gay men actually don't advance to AIDS as quickly as heterosexuals, as Asian Americans, as older Americans in Oregon. They are the ones, 50%, 68% of heterosexual males who will either have AIDS within 12 months or test having AIDS because they don't think they're at risk. They're getting much later into care. And so people need to be testing. I want to talk a little bit about how to frame this discussion, or how I think we need to frame it. You know, the first place I think we have failed miserably in the U.S. is prevention. I think some of that has to do with our policies, our federal administration, and our political will and our own community conversations. Today, the federal government spends on HIV prevention 20% less than it was spending 6 years ago in 2002. Today, and I've shared this message before, but I got to repeat it, we are much more likely to see a television commercial for Viagra, for Cialis. Erectile dysfunction is a common conversation, but God forbid we start talking about condoms in schools or showing it on television. Today, we have state policies, and in Oregon, we have some of the best policies in terms of what are we going to do in schools for HIV prevention and for sexuality education, but they're unfunded. So we've said, yes, we need good policies, but no one's putting the money behind it to make sure we're doing the sexual education in the schools. And so we have a long way to go in terms of what we do in prevention. I think there's 2 ways to really look at the argument, and there's probably more, but I'm going to share a couple because I only have 4 minutes left. One is the economic, and that's the most base, and if that's what it takes, I'll go there. You know, our U.S. Congresswoman Tammy Baldwin from the state of Wisconsin just put out a press release about 3 weeks ago, called for a doubling of the federal spending on HIV prevention. Her release said, according to the CDC, the 56,000 new infections that we have each year right now cost us $9.5 billion to take care of. Yet our country only spends $850 million on prevention to cover the whole country. Let's take it. Now, I looked at those estimates. I said that's kind of high. Let's look at Oregon. Just 300 new infections. I thought her numbering in terms of the actual cost was high, but I think if you did some research, you did some Googling, average care of people on treatment, I'm lucky, I'm insured. My medical costs in terms of treatment's about $24,000 a year. Okay, let's say average cost is $20,000. The 300 Oregonians who tested positive in 2008, forget the 7,000 before that, just the 300, that's a $6 million cost to treat for 1 year. Far less than this state even spends on prevention overall. And that's 1 year of infections. So there's a lot we can do, and the economic argument goes far. But let me talk about a social justice argument. We have to question that we have not taken action on a disease that's willing to wipe out communities of color, men who have sex with men, homeless populations, commercial sex workers, injecting drug users. There has to be some appeal to social justice to say, is it all right that those are the communities who are impacted, so we're not responding as much? And so if we're invested in social justice, we need to do a broad approach to social justice in terms of combating homophobia, combating racism, and saying we're engaged in the fight on HIV by doing those. I'm going to share just a couple more kind of frameworks to it, and then I'm wrapping up. I'll get that 3-minute timeline. A common sense approach. Let's face it. Okay, so some people say, well, heck, it's mostly 75% of infections are among gay and bisexual men, so it's less likely my daughter's going to be infected. Well, let me tell you, ta-da, the approach for HIV prevention, it's pretty similar to pregnancy prevention and to STD prevention. And we have several millions of dollars of cost and impact from unplanned pregnancy among young women, from STDs as well. And so we have a lot of work in terms of thinking about the fact that we need to get talking about sex. We need to talk about substance abuse, and we need to be a society that can move into those conversations. The last thing I want to cover is what can we do, what can you do as Oregonians? The first thing I want to say is, look, you should know your status. If you haven't had sex for 50 years and you haven't been at risk, my apologies, but if you have and you don't know, get yourself tested. You know what? It's free. You can ask your doctor to test you for HIV. And unfortunately, some people think, oh, doesn't my doctor just do this testing? This is not a routine thing that happens, but you should be saying to your doctor, if you are sexually active, I want to be tested for HIV. And if your doctor says, look, you're straight, you're middle-aged, don't worry about it, say no. I want to get tested, and that's my right, and I want it done today. You should also encourage the things we can be doing is having the conversations. Whether it's with your family, whether it's with your friends, whether it's at school, whether it's the dinner table. HIV cannot be a conversation for one day a year at World AIDS Day, but it needs to be happening in the schools, it needs to be happening at the kitchen table, and it needs to be happening in bed with your partner. It is a topic that we need to raise, and so I encourage us to each open that conversation. With my last minute, the last thing I'll do, and I told I couldn't plug my own organization, and that's great, because I want to be clear. Cascade AIDS Project works really hard, but there's a lot of groups working really hard in Oregon around HIV/AIDS prevention and care. Whether it's folks at Planned Parenthood, like the woman sitting on the panel with me, whether it's folks working at our House of Portland who's doing care for people living with HIV, partnership project in terms of case management for people with HIV, the HIV Day Center in terms of a drop-in center for homeless people living with HIV, Quest in terms of holistic care for people living with HIV, the HIV Alliance at Eugene doing everything from needle exchange and HIV prevention to care for people living with HIV/AIDS, Valley AIDS Information Network, and the list goes on, and we're struggling. The economy sucks, and we, unfortunately, can't cut back services. There are more people living with HIV, more demand, and we need to continue. And we depend on the generosity of individuals, and so I hope that Oregonians will continue to support the work of the many fine organizations throughout. And I think with that, I can wrap up my 30 minutes.
First question of our speaker, as always, will be posed by our Board of Governors host. Our board host today is Liz Riley. Liz Riley is Major Gifts and Capital Campaign Director with Planned Parenthood here in Portland. She has been a City Club member since 2006, currently serves as the chair of the club's membership committee. She's been a member of the Board of Governors since 2007. Liz?
Thank you very much. Now that antiretrovirals can prolong lives by decades, some say that high-risk groups are less concerned about contracting HIV. Because it's got less fear attached to it, are people more likely to resume taking risks and thereby increase its prevalence? And if so, what can be done about that?
I think ARTs has had a huge impact, antiretroviral treatment, in terms of, say, people, for a while in a lot of magazines, we saw a lot of ads of someone climbing a mountain who said, I'm HIV positive and I'm living healthy. And then all of a sudden, we sort of took away some of the fear of living with HIV. Part that I didn't talk about in my talk and I want to share is, look, it is not a picnic. Living with HIV, even those who test today, in the era of ARTs, still worry, will I be here 5 years from now? We know that many people are still going to AIDS in less than a year. And whether or not you're even worried about you worry about what's it mean for me as an individual living with HIV. Will I ever have a partner again or a loved one? So I think ARTs has somewhat changed the perspective of what it is to live with HIV. But to be very clear, it is not a picnic, and it is still difficult. I think, frankly, I don't think ARTs have undermined our HIV prevention efforts as much as our federal policy and our lack of political will to ensure the conversations happen in schools. I think that we have failed in reminding kids that the conversation needs to happen and happen repeatedly. Some people like to think, oh, it's like a vaccine. I can talk about HIV, we talked about it, we're done. Well, prevention is not a vaccine. It is an ongoing conversation that has to happen every day, and I think that's what's undermined prevention more than anything. Yeah.
Now is the time we take questions from the floor. Asking questions at Friday forums is a privilege of City Club membership. When you ask your question, please state your name, identify yourself as a City Club member. Please try to keep your question 30 seconds or less. And remember to ask a question as opposed to making a speech. Mr. Cox.
Thank you for being here today. You did several things that I thought were very important, one of which was being honest. I want to match your honesty. I want to say to this group, I've never told anybody before except my Facebook page. I'm in an open relationship. I've got 2 partners. We've all been tested, and we continue to be tested once a year. The concept of social justice is in tension, I believe, with the value of personal responsibility. Social justice says that society is responsible and that society must change for things to be fixed. Yet you called for personal responsibility. We must know our status. You must know your partner's status. You must use condoms. An argument divided against itself cannot stand. Which of those 2 arguments, social justice or personal responsibility, do you think is going to take us further in solving this?
To be clear, I think social justice impacts my ability for personal responsibility. When social justice does not say it's wrong to tell me I can't be gay and be valued, when social justice says you're of less value because you're a person of color, when social justice doesn't speak out in terms of people using substances and how do we care for them, and when we give messages to people that they're not important, how do we expect them to take personal responsibility and value their own life if we have a society who has said, you're not important? So they come together. If you tell me I'm of value, if you tell me I'm important, and you tell me I can change my world, and I'm just as important because I'm Latino or black or gay or whatever, I'm empowered. And I have the ability then to use my personal empowerment.
So what you're saying is that social justice is the gateway to a greater level of personal responsibility.
I believe it has, yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Peter Livingston, City Club member. I was interested in your suggestion that people ask their doctors for an HIV test. And that's probably a good idea for many people, but anyone who does that needs to be aware that a positive result will have very serious effects on their insurance prospects. And it might be helpful for the people listening here and also on the radio to know where they can go and the cost of testing that will not be reported to insurance companies.
Absolutely. There's a couple things, and although I do want to be clear, back in the era when I tested HIV positive and my doctor said I was sick and he said, you should get tested. And I said, no, I don't want you to do it. I want to go to a clinic because I'm scared of what it means for my health insurance. Those days are supposed to be gone. That the insurance industry, just like the employment, every sector, HIV is protected under the American with Disability Act. And they are not supposed to be discriminating based on HIV status. And your carrier, your insurance provider, should not be able to discontinue or change your coverage simply because you tested HIV positive. That said, it's important for people to feel comfortable getting tested where they want to get tested. At Cascade AIDS Project, we, through our Men's Wellness Center over on Stark Street, offer HIV testing a couple nights a week. But there's also, if you go, there's several other places, whether it's through the county, who'll do testing on a sliding scale and you don't need to provide your insurance, or if you go online, if you go to Cascade AIDS, CASCEAIDS.org. If you go to our website, you'll see a link to the AIDS STD Oregon hotline. It's also, I believe, OregonAIDSHotline.org. And if you go to that site, you will find testing sites throughout the state, and you can search by county to find a place to get HIV tested. Thank you.
Hi, Michael. I'm Joyce Tamanen, City Club member. You talked about the need for greater frankness and honesty in terms of sexual education, potentially high school, and I know there's been a pullback in a lot of health education. Do you know of good role models or good examples where really a more open, honest look at sexuality in teenagers is being done in a way that's respectful to all the different cultural groups that you mentioned who are adversely impacted by AIDS?
You're stumping me, but I'm going to try. I mean, first of all, I know Oregon is actually a national role model in terms of what we do with teens and teen-to-teen education and peer education. We're also considered a national role model in terms of what Oregon has for state policies. So our policies are really good. The thing is, schools are controlled by local school districts. Not the city of Portland nor the state of Oregon really has that much influence on what's going to happen in the schools. And so it requires parents getting involved in their local school districts, going to the school district board. I've seen individual school districts, and I'll talk from Minnesota, who did amazing things. In the Twin Cities, both Minneapolis and St. Paul, set up district-wide support systems for gay, lesbian, bisexual students, and said every school will have either a Gay Straight Alliance or support place, and we will have policies against harassment and bullying and all those factors, and we will do sex education. But it's a piece by piece, and so you know, what I'll encourage is to find specific examples. I'm looking at one of my staff members, Sheila Johnson, who works in our HIV education. I'm sure she could give specific examples. So if you reach us through our website, we'll try to get exact models.
Jan Lapine, City Club member. My question is for you personally. How, when you first learned about your infection, did your family respond, and how are they responding today? And the third part, what is out there to educate families and give them an idea of how to support?
Thank you. You know, I was lucky. I have a very supportive family. It was 1992, and to be really frank, coming out as HIV positive was 100 times more difficult for me than telling my parents I was gay. To say I was gay was saying, look, this is who I am, and you guys have always taught me to be proud of myself, and I'm proud of who I am, and my parents were very supportive. To come out as HIV positive says, oh shoot, I messed up. I partook in a risk behavior, and now I'm infected. And the reality is, I know my brothers who are straight do those same risk behaviors, and I just shot of the chance was the one who wasn't lucky. But it was a much harder thing to tell, and I think it was much harder for my parents. My mom at first was angry. She was like, how could you do this? How could you get infected? You should know better. And part of me was like, Mom, have you talked to David and Danny, my brothers, in terms of are they using a condom every time they're with a woman? And they've come around a long way. They will be here next week, and for our Cascade AIDS Project annual art auction to support me and to support Cascade AIDS Project. They're hugely supportive. They continue to worry in terms of your health, but I think they're getting the idea that, yes, I will take their inheritance, or at least hope to. So they're very supportive. I think the challenge for where can people find support in terms of families, That's a difficult one. There's, certainly I have found through Cascade AIDS Project, we have 700 individuals who volunteer at Cascade AIDS Project each year and give us 20,000 hours of volunteer service. And a lot of those are families who've lost a loved one, a son or a brother or sister, who find kind of that connection by getting engaged, whether it's volunteering with us or through our House of Portland or HIV Alliance. I think sometimes getting engaged with some of the HIV programs is a way to say, I can find others who are dealing with this from a familial standpoint but aren't directly living with it. Thank you.
Ted Kay, City Club member. As you look around the world, how do you see AIDS programs and policies and funding in the United States comparing with other countries? And if there are better models or better activities in other countries, would you identify those?
Yeah. A couple discrepancies between us and other countries. The U.S., when we started the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, really pushed that every country shall have a national HIV/AIDS strategy. This was under the Bush administration in 2003. And for 5 years, we told countries, you better have a national strategy that crosses over your Ministry of Health, your Ministry of Education, your Ministry of Labor. In the U.S., we have never had a national strategy in terms of how we respond to AIDS. Now, one of the things that has changed is in the fiscal year 09 budget, there was a request put in for $1.5 million for our country, for the U.S., for the first time ever, to develop a national AIDS strategy. And our new AIDS czar, Jeff Crowley, is given the power to work with, at a higher level, at the White House level, to develop a national strategy that crosses over, and I hope it brings in the Department of Education, the Department of Labor, and does a much broader place. So that's one place where in some developing countries they've done better. Some other examples of countries, Brazil has been really cutting edge in terms of generics, in terms of access to drugs, in terms of saying access to treatment. They've also been, Brazil did a radical thing about 3 or 4 years ago, and they said to the U.S. government, we don't want your funds. If you're going to tell us we have to set policies that condemn commercial sex workers when we think we have to work in a respectful way with them, we're not going to take your funding. And they stood strong on their policies. In some developing countries, our funds via U.S. Agency for International Development are doing amazing campaigns on condom social marketing. One of the biggest groups doing this is PSI, who does condom social marketing in a lot of developing countries. And so the U.S. has invested in marketing condoms hugely via TV, and yet we have done nothing in the U.S. to do mass kind of behavior change in terms of using condom and reducing risk. So those are a few places where I think there are a couple lessons to learn that are happening in developing countries that aren't happening in the U.S. In other places, the U.S., far before Africa, started talking about prevention and care. That stop thinking about me just as someone living with HIV and recognize that I'm still sexually active. And if you want to have success in your HIV prevention efforts, you better be talking to me as someone living with HIV in terms of how you're going to work with me to be able to disclose my status and to help in your prevention efforts. So there's lessons from both sides to go both ways.
It's more and more common to do a home HIV test. Do you feel that the benefits of increased testing outweigh the costs of not having a professional on site to help counsel someone through the results?
Now, I don't have the statistics about home testing. I remember them trying to launch it in the early 90s, and I'm looking at our Director of Prevention and Education, but my belief is home testing doesn't really happen much at all in the U.S. There's one approved home testing kit, but I would guess in terms of the percentage of Americans who do home testing, pretty small. This is my personal belief, which is I do believe at times the AIDS industry, the AIDS service organizations have put so much protocol around counseling and testing that we've in times made it hard to make it routinized and more accessible. I know I have staff who work at CAP who have a different belief, and we debate that. I believe individuals all have different needs. And look, I think for anyone who's getting HIV tested, we have an obligation to ensure we're ready, with counseling. We're ready to tell them what resources are out there. We're ready to provide support. But we shouldn't make the assumption that everyone needs that. Some people are really empowered, already work in the field, know the resources. And they say, give me, sometimes, and no offense against my medical care provider, but I would be thrilled if 7-Eleven did lab testing and I could just go in, get my labs, be done, and not have to talk to a medical care provider at times. I feel like I know what I need to know. So I think it's absolutely critical to ensure it's available, but I think we shouldn't make it a required thing for all testing. Okay.
In the spirit of full communication about this, could you help our audience who is not as informed on all of this as we should be understand a little more why the incidence is so much higher in men than women?
The first thing to clarify is globally the incidence is higher among women. In fact, in Africa, 60% of all infections are among women. But part of what impacts HIV, there's so many factors. So in the, HIV is, when it's reached a generalized epidemic like it has in sub-Saharan Africa, it's sort of hitting everyone. Part of it, and I don't know how graphic you can get on radio and TV, is sexual behaviors. So men who have sex with men, if it's in terms of sexual behavior, have some behaviors that are higher risk in terms of anal sex, which is probably the riskiest behavior, as opposed to vaginal sex, which would probably be the next level of risky behavior, and then oral sex. So some of it has to do with pure risk. The other thing that impacts, they just did some huge studies in Africa and found in terms of for men themselves, circumcision is a protective factor. That for those who are circumcised, they were 60 to 66% less likely to get HIV infected. So for a man to be circumcised was protective for himself. I'm not saying it's protective for the woman, but for himself. The other thing in Africa is gender norms. Women are, in terms of empowerment, in terms of the right to say no to sex, in terms of the ability to decide how they want to have sex and who they have sex with. There are a lot of cultures where that power just has not been shared, and so then infection's much more likely to get them.
Okay, we have run out of time and need to stop there for this week. Next week, please join us for that panel on the future of democracy in a society where newspapers seem to be at risk. There is a membership table in the back right. Please grab at least one, if not more, membership brochures and put them to good use. And as we close, please join me in expressing our thanks to our speaker for today. Our speakers usually know what they're talking about. I don't think there's any question that this speaker knows his subject matter, and we're very appreciative of having been here. Michael Kaplan of Cascade AIDS Project, thank you very much. We are adjourned.